Don't believe everything you think. By Joseph Nguyen. Here is a scene that Joseph Nguyen asks you to imagine near the very beginning of this book. Two people are sitting in the same coffee shop. They are surrounded by the same strangers. They are smelling the same freshly brewed coffee. They are experiencing, in every measurable external way, the exact same moment. But one of them is quietly falling apart. They are in the middle of what Nguyen calls a quarter-life existential crisis, spiraling through every unresolved question about their career, their relationships, their worth, their future. Everything feels urgent and broken and uncertain, and the weight of all of it is pressing down right now, in this ordinary chair, in this ordinary coffee shop, surrounded by ordinary strangers who seem, infuriatingly, to have no idea there is a crisis occurring. The other person is happily watching those same strangers. They are enjoying their drink. They are at ease. They are, in the most basic and available sense, fine. Same external reality. Radically different internal experience. And the question that this image raises, the question that the entire book is organized around, is this: what is the difference between them? Not in their circumstances. Their circumstances are identical. What is the difference in what is happening inside them? Nguyen's answer is direct and radical and ancient, and in the way he frames it, genuinely transformative if you let it land. The difference is not the situation. The difference is thought. One person is, at that moment, generating a particular quality and quantity of thinking about their life. The other is not. One person is, at that moment, living inside the story their mind is constructing about what the external circumstances mean. The other is simply present to the external circumstances themselves. And the entire difference between suffering and peace, in this moment and in every moment, lives right there. In whether you are inside the thinking or whether you are present to what is actually here. This is the central insight of Don't Believe Everything You Think. It is not a new insight. Nguyen says so explicitly and with genuine humility. He traces it to Buddhist philosophy, to Zen, to the Stoics, to Shakespeare's Hamlet, and most directly to a Scottish welder named Sydney Banks who experienced what he described as a profound psychological illumination in 1973 and spent the rest of his life articulating what he called the three principles, the framework that forms the philosophical backbone of everything Nguyen builds in this book. Don't Believe Everything You Think was self-published in 2022. It found its audience primarily through TikTok and word of mouth rather than traditional publishing infrastructure. It became a New York Times bestseller. It has been translated into more than 40 languages and has sold millions of copies worldwide. In 2025, Joseph Nguyen was named a NAMI ambassador, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which speaks to the mental health community's recognition of the book's reach. However mixed the feelings about it are among clinicians. The book is short. In its original edition, roughly 100 pages. In the expanded edition, somewhat more, with journaling prompts and additional chapters addressing reader questions. It is, as multiple reviewers have noted, deceptively simple, simple in the way that things are when they're pointing towards something genuinely true, and simple also in the way that things can be when the complexity has been quietly removed to make the pointing easier. Both are true of this book, and both are worth taking seriously. Let's walk through all of it. Part 1. The Journey to the Root Cause. Nguyen's personal story. The book opens not with philosophy, but with autobiography. Joseph Nguyen had been, in his early 20s, someone who tried everything. He is explicit about the inventory: therapy, medication, journaling, gratitude practices, affirmations, vision boards, meditation apps, cold showers, morning routines, productivity systems. Self-help books by the shelf load. He had read and tried and implemented. And he had remained, beneath all the frameworks and habits and techniques, fundamentally unhappy. Not dramatically unhappy. Not dramatically anything. Just persistently, quietly, underneath everything unhappy in a way that no practice or technique seemed to reach. He describes this as living in what he calls the tyranny of technique. The belief that if he just found the right method, the right framework, the right sequence of morning habits, he would eventually arrive at the stable happiness and peace that he could see other people seeming to have. Each new book or system would produce a temporary lift, the honeymoon phase of a new practice, when everything feels possible. And then the lift would fade, and the underlying experience would remain, and he would begin the search again. What changed was not a new technique. What changed was a shift in understanding. He encountered the ideas of Sydney Banks through various teachers and books in the Three Principles tradition, and something clicked that he describes as less like learning a new thing and more like suddenly seeing something that had always been true, but that he had never quite been able to see. The source of his suffering was not his circumstances. It was not his history. It was not the specific content of his problems. It was the thinking itself. The relentless, automatic, believed thinking that constructed his experience of everything and that he had been his whole life, mistaking for reality. He says, with the kind of directness that is either refreshing or alarming depending on your relationship with bold claims, this understanding changed everything. Not gradually. Not through sustained practice. Through a shift in seeing that, once made, reorganized his entire relationship with his own mind. He is aware, he says, that this will sound suspicious. It sounds like the kind of thing people say when they want to sell you something. And he acknowledges the irony. But he writes it anyway because it is what he experienced and because the book is, at its root, his attempt to offer that shift in seeing to anyone willing to look. Part 2. The root cause of all suffering. Thought is not reality here is the central claim of the book stated as clearly as possible. We do not live in reality. We live in our thinking about reality. And the suffering we experience, not the pain of loss or injury or illness, which is physical and real and not the book's primary subject, but the psychological suffering of anxiety, shame, rumination, self-doubt, resentment, and existential dread, arises entirely from thought, not from circumstances, from the thinking we are doing about those circumstances. Nguyen uses a formulation that recurs throughout the book. We live in a world of thought, not reality. Each person sitting in that coffee shop is experiencing not the coffee shop itself, but their thought-constructed version of it. The anxious person is not responding to the objective facts of their situation. They are responding to the meaning their thinking has assembled from those facts, the narrative of inadequacy and urgency and threat that their mind has generated, and that they are, in this moment, experiencing as if it were the direct perception of reality. This is not, Nguyen is careful to say, a claim that external circumstances don't matter, or that suffering can always be dissolved by thinking differently. He distinguishes between pain and suffering. Pain, the direct experience of something genuinely difficult or harmful, is real and unavoidable. The loss of someone you love produces pain that is honest and appropriate, and not a thinking error. The physical experience of illness or injury produces pain that is direct and real. Nguyen is not telling you that pain is optional. He is saying that suffering, the additional psychological layer that thinking builds on top of pain, the anxiety about anxiety, the narrative of what pain means, the spiraling elaboration that extends a difficult experience far beyond its natural duration, that layer is generated by thought. And thought, unlike external circumstances, is something you can have a different relationship with. He makes a comparison that is simple and worth dwelling on. He says that events are neutral. Something happens. A thing occurs in the world. In itself, before the mind touches it, the event carries no inherent meaning, no inherent emotional charge. It is simply what happened. Then thought arrives and labels it good, bad, threatening, confirming, humiliating, joyful. And the feeling that arises is not a response to the event. It is a response to the thought about the event, which means, he argues, that the feeling is always, in the most precise sense, the product of thinking. And thinking, unlike the weather, unlike other people's behavior, unlike the 10,000 things that happen to you every day without your permission, is something you are not required to believe. Part 3. Why do we even think? The evolutionary trap, one of the most useful explanatory sections in the book, addresses a question that many readers find genuinely puzzling once the central argument has landed. If thinking is the source of suffering, why do we think so much? Why has evolution produced a mind that can generate this much misery? Wasn't thinking supposed to help us? Nguyen's answer draws on evolutionary psychology in a way that is accessible rather than technical. The thinking mind, the analytical, threat-scanning, pattern-finding mind, evolved primarily as a survival tool. Its job, for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, was to keep you alive in a world that was genuinely dangerous. To scan for predators. To remember which plants were poisonous. To anticipate the behavior of rival groups. To plan for the winter, avoid the dangerous river crossing, learn from the experience of being wrong in ways that didn't kill you. This mind was extraordinarily good at its job. It is why we survived. The problem is that this survival-oriented, threat-anticipating mind did not evolve to produce happiness or peace or a clear-eyed assessment of what is actually dangerous in the present moment. It evolved to survive. And surviving, in the environment it was built for, required constant vigilance, constant scanning for what might go wrong, constant attention to threat, constant elaboration of potential dangers and how to avoid them. The tragedy is that this same mind, transplanted into a modern environment where most of the acute physical threats of ancestral life are absent, keeps running. It scans for threats in the social environment the way it once scanned for predators. It catastrophizes about professional setbacks the way it once anticipated the behavior of dangerous animals. It generates anxiety about relationships and status and the future with the same relentless energy it once devoted to genuine survival. The hardware is the same. The environment has changed. And the gap between what the mind was built for and what it is now doing to you is, Nguyen argues, the primary source of most human psychological suffering. He extends this into a direct observation about the modern world. We have created an environment that maximizes the stimulation of the threat detection system. News media that optimizes for outrage. Social media that compares you relentlessly to the curated best moments of everyone you know. A culture of productivity that treats stillness as laziness and rest as falling behind. A consumer economy that profits from your dissatisfaction. All of these are not conspiracies. They are the emergent properties of systems that have discovered, very efficiently, that a mind in a state of activated threat response is an excellent consumer, viewer, and voter. And the person living inside that activated mind pays the cost. Part 4. Thoughts versus thinking. The most important distinction in the book here is the distinction that Nguyen identifies as the conceptual key to everything, the thing that, once understood, makes the entire framework click into place. And it is a distinction that is genuinely easy to miss because the words seem almost interchangeable. But they are not. A thought is a piece of mental content that arises. It appears in awareness the way weather appears, without your choosing it, without your inviting it, simply arising and, if left alone, passing. You didn't decide to think the thought you just thought. You couldn't have predicted it in the moment before it arrived. It arrived on its own, as thoughts do, as part of the continuous stream of mental activity that runs in every human mind at essentially all times. Thinking is what you do with a thought once it arrives. Thinking is the active, effortful process of engaging with a thought, elaborating it, interrogating it, believing it, arguing with it, building a narrative on top of it, extending it into the future, connecting it to other thoughts, using it as evidence for or against some conclusion about yourself or the world. Thinking is the thing that transforms a passing thought into a sustained state of mind. Thinking is the thing that takes a thought about failure and turns it into an experience of being a failure. Thinking is the energy that keeps the thought alive, gives it weight, makes it feel like reality rather than like weather. The practical implication is enormous. You cannot stop thoughts from arising. This is not a goal the book is setting. Thoughts arise automatically as part of the basic functioning of a human mind, and no technique or practice will or should eliminate them. But you can stop thinking. Not permanently, not constantly, but in specific moments when you notice that you are engaged in the active elaboration of a thought that is generating suffering, you can simply stop adding energy to it. Not by forcing it away. Not by replacing it with a positive thought. Simply by withdrawing the effortful engagement that gives the thought its power and letting it pass the way weather passes. Present for a moment, then gone. He uses an image that has resonated with many readers: quicksand. When you fall into quicksand, the instinct, the panicked, survival-driven instinct, is to struggle, to fight, to try to force your way out. And the struggling makes you sink faster. The counterintuitive technique for surviving quicksand is to go still, to stop fighting, to distribute your weight and let the medium support you rather than consuming your energy in a battle you cannot win. Thoughts, Nguyen suggests, operate by similar physics. The more you engage with a difficult thought, the more you struggle with it, argue with it, try to eliminate it, analyze why you're having it, the deeper you sink. The path out is not fighting. The path out is stillness. Not the stillness of suppression. The stillness of simply not adding more thinking to what already arose. Part 5. The three principles: mind, consciousness, and thought. This is the theoretical heart of the book. And it requires some care because it is simultaneously the most philosophically interesting and the most potentially confusing section. Nguyen draws explicitly on the framework developed by Sydney Banks, the three principles of universal mind, universal consciousness, and universal thought, and it is worth understanding both what Banks meant and how Nguyen applies it. Sydney Banks was not an academic. He was a Scottish-born welder living in British Columbia when, in 1973, he had what he described as a sudden, overwhelming insight into the nature of human psychological experience. He spent the rest of his life, he died in 2009, articulating this insight, which he summarized in the three principles. These principles have since been developed into a school of psychological practice, sometimes called three-principle psychology, or the inside-out understanding, and have influenced practitioners working in therapy, addiction recovery, education, and organizational development. The first principle is universal mind, which Banks described as the intelligence behind all living things. Not intelligence in the sense of cognitive capacity, but in the sense of the organizing force that allows a tree to grow toward light, that allows the body to heal a wound, that allows an ecosystem to restore balance after disruption. It is the life energy, the creative intelligence, that underlies and animates all of existence. Nguyen frames this as the source of everything, the ground from which all experience arises. He connects it to the intuition and inner wisdom that the book returns to repeatedly, the knowing that arises when the thinking quiets, the sense of clarity and rightness that comes not from analysis, but from a deeper source. The second principle is universal consciousness, the capacity to be aware, to experience, to know that you exist. This is the aspect of the framework that is closest to what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, the simple, irreducible fact of there being something that it is like to be you. Without consciousness, there is no experience. The principles are interdependent. Universal mind provides the creative intelligence. Universal consciousness provides the awareness through which experience is registered. And universal thought provides the medium through which that experience is shaped into the particular, individual, moment-to-moment content of a life. The third principle, universal thought, is the one that receives the most attention in the book because it is the most immediately actionable. Universal thought is the capacity to think, the faculty through which the raw creative potential of universal mind is formed into the specific content of personal experience. Thought, in this framework, is not merely the neurological activity of a brain. It is the principle by which the infinite potential of consciousness is shaped into the particular, individual, moment-to-moment experience of a life. And because thought is what creates experience, changing your relationship with thought, specifically, recognizing that thought is a tool rather than a truth, a medium rather than a mirror of reality, changes your experience at the most fundamental level available. Nguyen uses a clarifying analogy. He compares thought to a projector and experience to the image on a screen. Most of us spend our lives trying to change the image on the screen, trying to rearrange our circumstances, manage other people's behavior, fix the external world to match our preferences. What the three principles framework suggests is that the image on the screen is determined by what's in the projector, not by anything inherent in the screen itself. And changing what's in the projector, or rather, recognizing that the projector is running and that you are not the image it is showing, is the only thing that produces a genuine change in the experience. Part 6. NON Thinking. What it actually means, this is where the book gets most provocative and most easily misunderstood. And it is worth spending real time here, because the misunderstanding is consequential. When Nguyen talks about non-thinking or stopping thinking as the path through suffering, he is not, he says so explicitly, advocating for the elimination of thought or the suppression of mental activity. He is not suggesting that analysis, planning, problem-solving, or critical thinking are bad or to be avoided. The prescription is more nuanced than it initially appears. Non-thinking, as Nguyen uses the term, is a state of awareness in which you are not caught in the compulsive, ruminative, self-referential loop of thinking that generates suffering. It is the state you enter when you are fully absorbed in something you love, when the sense of a separate you doing the activity dissolves into the activity itself. Athletes call it flow. Musicians call it being in the zone. Meditators call it presence. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent his career studying it and called it optimal experience. Nguyen calls it non-thinking, and by it, he means the state in which the continuous background commentary, the self-evaluating, threat scanning, past reviewing, future projecting inner monologue, falls temporarily silent, and what remains is direct, unmediated engagement with the present moment. He argues, and this is one of the book's most practically important claims, that this state is not an achievement. It is not something you attain through years of meditation practice or the perfect morning routine. It is the natural state of a mind that is not actively engaging in ruminative thinking. The non-thinking state is what is already there, underneath the thinking. It is not created by practice. It is revealed by the cessation of what has been covering it. Like sunlight that is always present behind clouds, the sun doesn't need to be switched on when the clouds part. It was there the entire time. The practical implication is that the path to peace is not the addition of more technique. It is the recognition that the thinking generating the suffering is something you are doing, not something happening to you, and that you can in any moment simply not do it. Not by forcing thought away. By withdrawing the energy of engaged elaboration and allowing the thought to pass on its own, the way a cloud passes across a sky it cannot permanently occupy. He also addresses an objection that essentially every reader raises at this point. Doesn't non-thinking mean not making decisions, not planning for the future, not solving problems? His response distinguishes between thinking that arises from what he calls inspiration and thinking that arises from what he calls desperation. Inspired thinking, the thinking that occurs when you are genuinely engaged with a problem, when your full creative intelligence is brought to bear on something that matters. When the work is flowing, this is not the kind of thinking Nguyen is asking you to stop. This is useful, alive, purposeful engagement. Desperate thinking, the anxious, ruminating, spiraling, self-attacking kind that generates heat without light, that circles the same problem repeatedly without moving toward resolution. That is the kind of thinking the book is addressing. And the difference between the two is not difficult to feel when you know to look for it. Part 7. Goals from Inspiration versus Goals from Desperation. One of the most practically important sections of the book addresses something that most goal-setting frameworks entirely ignore. The psychological source of your goals. Not what the goals are, where they come from, and why the source matters enormously for whether pursuing them produces flourishing or suffering. Nguyen draws a distinction that is, in his telling, the difference between two completely different modes of living. Goals from desperation are goals generated by fear, by lack, by the urgent sense that if you don't achieve this thing you will remain broken, incomplete, unworthy, unloved, or unsafe. The person who needs to make more money because they are afraid of what it means about them if they don't. The person who needs the relationship because they are terrified of what it means to be alone. The person who needs the achievement because without it the sense of their own inadequacy is unbearable. These goals may be legitimate in their content. The problem is their source. When a goal is generated by desperation, by the felt need to escape an intolerable internal state, achieving it doesn't resolve the internal state. It provides a temporary relief. The way scratching an itch provides temporary relief, but the itch returns, the state reasserts itself, and the goalpost moves to the next thing that might finally provide what the last thing didn't. Goals from inspiration are a different animal entirely. They arise not from lack but from fullness, from the genuine desire to express, create, contribute, explore. The artist who makes work because the making is intrinsically alive and meaningful, not because recognition will fix their self-worth. The parent who engages with their children because the engagement is itself the reward, not because being a good parent will prove something about them. The professional who pursues excellence because the excellence itself is satisfying, not because the achievement will finally silence the inner critic. These goals, pursued from a state of genuine inspiration rather than existential desperation, produce a fundamentally different quality of lived experience, not because the external outcomes are necessarily different, but because the inner life in which they are pursued is fundamentally different. He connects this to a practical diagnostic question that the book encourages you to bring to any goal or ambition you're pursuing. Where does this come from? Is this coming from a genuine, positive desire to move toward something I value? Or is this coming from a fear of what it means about me if I don't achieve it? The honest answer to that question tells you more about the likely quality of your experience in pursuit of the goal than the goal itself does. And it gives you, potentially, the option of either changing the goal or, more radically and more usefully, changing the relationship from which you're pursuing it. Part 8. Unconditional Love and Creation. The state beyond thinking. The chapters on unconditional love and creation are the most spiritually oriented in the book and the ones that will either resonate most deeply or produce the most resistance, depending on your orientation. Nguyen makes claims here that go beyond psychology into territory that is genuinely philosophical and in some ways theological, and he does so with a confidence that the preceding framework, however internally consistent, may not fully support. His argument about love begins with a distinction between conditional and unconditional love. Conditional love, the kind most of us experience in ordinary relationships, is love that is contingent on certain things remaining true. I love you because you make me feel safe. I love you because you are kind to me. I love you because you meet my needs. This is not false love. It is real love. But it is love that can be withdrawn when the conditions change, which means it is not, in the deepest sense, security. It is love that carries within it the ever-present possibility of loss. Unconditional love, which Nguyen associates with a state of non-thinking, with the direct experience of presence unmediated by the thinking mind, is something he describes as the natural state of consciousness when thought is not actively distorting it. He suggests, drawing again on the three principles framework, that love is not something you feel because of someone else. It is what you are when thinking is not in the way. It is the quality of the pure awareness that underlies all experience, before the mind labels, compares, judges, and generates the stories that separate you from direct contact with life as it is. This is a profound and ancient claim. It echoes across Buddhist thought, Christian mysticism, Sufi poetry, and the non-dual traditions of Hinduism. The idea that love is not an emotion among other emotions, but the fundamental quality of consciousness itself, that it is what remains when everything else is stripped away, is one of the oldest and most consistent insights in the history of human spiritual inquiry. Nguyen's contribution is to connect it to the practical, accessible framework of the three principles and to make it available to people who are not seeking a spiritual tradition but who are simply suffering and looking for relief. On creation, Nguyen argues that the most genuinely creative work, in any field, arises not from the analytical, planning mind but from the deeper intelligence of the non-thinking state. He draws on the experiences of artists, athletes, and innovators who describe their most significant work as arising not from deliberate effort, but from something that felt like it came through them rather than from them. The musician who says the song wrote itself. The scientist who says the solution came to them in the shower, not at the desk. The athlete who says the winning moment came from somewhere beyond conscious technique. Nguyen's argument is that these are not rare, mystical exceptions. They are what creativity always looks like when thinking gets out of the way. And cultivating the capacity for non-thinking is, therefore, not only a path to psychological peace, but to genuine creative power. Part 9. Intuition, Nothing is Good or Bad. And How to Know What to Do. The later chapters of the book address a set of practical questions that naturally arise once the central framework has been established. If you stop trusting the relentless analysis of the thinking mind as your primary guide, what do you follow instead? If nothing is inherently good or bad, only thinking makes it so, how do you make decisions? If you stop thinking, how do you navigate a life that genuinely requires navigation? Nguyen's answer to all of these questions is the same: intuition. And his treatment of intuition is more philosophically grounded than the word usually suggests. He is not talking about superstition or magical thinking or the idea that your gut feelings are infallible guides to truth. He is talking about the kind of knowing that arises in the quiet space beneath the thinking, the direct, often wordless, often immediate sense of what is right or true or needed that is available to every human being, but that is consistently drowned out by the noise of ruminative thought. He draws a distinction between intuition and fear that echoes what we saw in The Mountain Is You, though Nguyen's framing is more philosophical and less psychological. Fear tends to be urgent, activated, physically charged, and specifically oriented toward a threat. Intuition tends to be quieter, more stable, less emotionally activated, and oriented not toward a threat, but toward a direction. Fear says run. Intuition says not here. Fear produces contraction. Intuition produces a gentle kind of knowing that persists across contexts and doesn't require emotional emergency to be heard. On the question of whether nothing is good or bad, Nguyen is careful to clarify that this is not moral nihilism. He is not saying that cruelty and kindness are equivalent, or that it doesn't matter what you do. He is saying that events themselves, the raw facts of what occurs, carry no inherent meaning before the mind assigns it. The meaning is always added by thought. And recognizing this has a specific practical value. It prevents you from treating your thought-generated interpretation of an event as if it were the event itself. The job loss is not inherently catastrophic. The criticism is not inherently confirming of your inadequacy. The uncertainty is not inherently a signal of doom. What they mean depends on the thinking you bring to them. And you have more freedom in that thinking than you ordinarily use. Part 10. Living in Non-Thinking, Practical Guidance and Obstacles. The final section of the book is the most practically oriented. And it is where Nguyen moves from explaining the framework to offering guidance for actually living it. He is honest here more than anywhere else about the gap between understanding the ideas and inhabiting them, a gap that the rest of the book can occasionally obscure through the confidence of its tone. He outlines several observable signs of the non-thinking state, markers that let you know when you are genuinely in it rather than merely thinking about being in it. A sense of ease and flow in whatever you are doing. An absence of the internal running commentary that ordinarily accompanies experience. A quality of presence, of being genuinely here rather than mentally elsewhere. A lightness, or what he calls an absence of the weight of thought. He is careful to say that this state is not permanent, is not the elimination of all thought, and is not something you maintain continuously. It is something you return to repeatedly. And returning to it becomes more natural and more frequent with practice. Not the practice of a specific technique, but the practice of simply noticing when you've been pulled into thinking and allowing the thinking to settle. He addresses the obstacles that predictably arise when people begin working with this framework. The most common is what he calls the ego's resistance, the thinking mind's tendency to assert that this is too simple, that real suffering requires more serious treatment, that you can't possibly just stop thinking and feel better. He acknowledges this objection honestly and responds to it by pointing out that the objection is itself an example of the thinking he's describing. The thought, "this can't be this simple," is a thought. You can notice it and let it pass, the same way you can notice any other thought. He also addresses the guilt that many people feel about feeling good, the sense that if your circumstances are difficult, you are in some way betraying the reality of that difficulty by choosing peace rather than suffering. His response is both philosophical and practical. Your suffering does not honor the difficulty of your circumstances. It adds to the total quantity of suffering in the world without changing the circumstances. Peace in the face of genuine difficulty is not denial or indifference. It is the condition from which the most effective response to the difficulty is possible. The critique, where don't believe everything you think overpromises, oversimplifies, and earns honest scrutiny. Now let us be fully honest. Because this book, more than any other in this series, requires honest and even pointed critical engagement. Not because its central insight is wrong. The core observation that psychological suffering is generated by thought rather than by circumstances is genuinely valuable, genuinely ancient, and genuinely supported by significant threads of psychological research. But the way that insight is presented in this book, the claims built around it, and the absence of crucial qualification create a set of problems that are serious enough to name clearly. Let's begin with what is perhaps the most significant single issue in the book: the claim that this approach works for everyone, in all circumstances, without exception. Nguyen states explicitly and repeatedly that no matter what has happened to you, no matter where you are from, no matter what you have done, you can find total peace, unconditional love, complete fulfillment, and abundance. No person, he says, is an exception to this. This is not a modest claim. It is a universal claim. And universal claims about human psychology require either an extraordinary evidential foundation or an extraordinary degree of intellectual humility about the limits of what is being claimed. This book has neither. There is no clinical evidence cited in support of the claim that this framework reliably produces peace and freedom from suffering across the full range of human psychological conditions. There are no references to controlled studies, no clinical case reports, no systematic evidence of any kind that the three principles approach, on which the book is substantially based, produces the outcomes Nguyen claims for it. This matters because the book is explicitly addressing people in psychological suffering, people with anxiety, depression, self-doubt, trauma histories, addictions, self-sabotaging patterns. For many of these people, the suggestion that their suffering is generated entirely by thought and can be resolved by changing their relationship with thinking is not merely incomplete. It is potentially harmful. The person with a clinically significant anxiety disorder is not suffering primarily because they are thinking too much. They are suffering because of a specific, measurable dysregulation in their nervous system's threat response circuitry that does not resolve through insight alone and that often requires targeted clinical intervention. The person with major depressive disorder is not trapped in a thought loop they can simply recognize and step out of. They are experiencing a neurobiological state that is not primarily the product of ruminative thinking, and that is not reliably addressed by philosophical reframing. Nguyen acknowledges elsewhere that he is not a therapist and that professional help may be needed for serious conditions. But the acknowledgement is so brief, and the book's central message so confident in the universality of its prescription, that many readers who need clinical support will instead conclude that the problem is their failure to properly apply the framework, which adds self-blame to whatever they were already carrying. Second, the three principles framework on which the book is largely based is not a recognized psychological theory in the scientific sense. Sydney Banks was not a psychologist. He had no academic training in psychology, philosophy, or neuroscience. His framework has been developed by practitioners and is used in some therapeutic and coaching contexts. But it has not been subjected to the kind of rigorous empirical testing that would allow confident claims about its efficacy. There are some small, preliminary studies in the three principles literature, but they are neither numerous nor methodologically robust enough to support the universal claims the book makes. Nguyen presents the framework as if it is established truth rather than one perspective among many, and for a book that will reach millions of people, the standards of intellectual honesty should be higher. Third, the distinction between thoughts and thinking, which is one of the book's most genuinely useful ideas, is presented with a clarity and cleanness that the actual phenomenology of mental experience does not always support. In the theoretical framework, it sounds clear: a thought arises, and thinking is what you add to it. In practice, the line between noticing a thought and being caught in thinking is often not the clean perceptual threshold the book implies. For many people, particularly those with anxiety, OCD, or rumination-prone minds, the noticing of a thought is itself already a form of engagement with it. The effort to observe without engaging often becomes another layer of thinking. The practice of trying not to think about something is, famously, one of the most reliable ways to keep thinking about it. The book's guidance here, just don't add energy to the thought, is easier to describe than to execute. and more difficult than the confident tone suggests for people whose mental architecture makes that gap particularly hard to navigate. Fourth, the concept of non-thinking, while pointing towards something real and genuinely valuable, the state of flow, of presence, of direct engagement unmediated by ruminative commentary, is framed in a way that can be misleading about how that state is cultivated. The book implies that it is available in any moment through simple recognition that the non-thinking state is what's already there, and you simply stop adding thinking to access it. For some people, in some moments, this is accurate and useful. For many people, developing a more stable capacity for that state requires sustained practice, meditation, somatic work, therapy, contemplative disciplines developed over years. The idea that it is simply a recognition, available immediately and effortlessly once you understand the framework, sets an expectation that the reality of practice may not meet. And when the expectation isn't met, the reader is likely to conclude either that they are uniquely incapable or that the framework is wrong, when the truth is simply that the book made it sound easier than it is. Fifth, the book's treatment of goals and ambition. The distinction between goals from inspiration and goals from desperation, while genuinely useful, glosses over a real question about how to function in a world that does not organize itself around your inner state. Most people are not in a position to pursue only inspired goals. Most people have financial obligations, family responsibilities, professional requirements, and social structures that generate genuine external pressures that are not fully reducible to their psychological relationship with those pressures. The person who is working 2 jobs to pay rent and support their children is not primarily suffering because they are pursuing goals from desperation rather than inspiration. They are suffering because the material conditions of their life are genuinely difficult. And telling them that the solution is to access a non-thinking state from which inspired action will flow naturally is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that can function as dismissal of the genuine structural difficulty they face. Sixth, the book's borrowing from Sydney Banks's 3 principles and from Buddhist and contemplative traditions more broadly is done with acknowledgement, but without the intellectual rigor that the borrowing deserves. The 3 principles framework, whatever its value as a practical orientation, is a metaphysical framework, a claim about the ultimate nature of reality that is neither provable nor falsifiable in any scientific sense. Universal mind as the intelligence behind all living things, consciousness as a universal principle rather than a product of specific biological systems, thought as a cosmic principle rather than a neural process. These are philosophical and spiritual positions that rest on faith and interpretation rather than evidence. Nguyen presents them as if they are established truths about how reality works, rather than as one metaphysical perspective among many. And for readers without a strong background in critical thinking or philosophy, the confident presentation can make the metaphysical assumptions invisible. And finally, the critique that is always true of every book in this genre. And that is worth stating here with particular emphasis because this book's central message specifically concerns the relationship between reading about an insight and actually inhabiting it. Understanding the idea that thought creates suffering is not the same as being free from thought-generated suffering. Recognizing in this moment that you are engaging in ruminative thinking is not the same as having developed the stable, embodied capacity to not be swept away by it the next time you are triggered, exhausted, grieving, or genuinely frightened. The book can give you the map. The territory requires something more: time, practice, patience, professional support where needed, the kindness to not hate yourself when the thinking returns. All of which the book points toward, incompletely. Final thoughts. Let's end with what is most true about this book and most honest about its place in the landscape of ideas it is entering. The core insight, that we suffer not from our circumstances, but from the thinking we layer on top of our circumstances, and that we have more freedom in that relationship than we ordinarily use, is genuinely important. It is not new. It is in the Buddhist canon. It is in the Stoic tradition. It is in Shakespeare and in cognitive behavioral therapy and in the mindfulness literature and in the work of dozens of psychologists and philosophers across centuries. Joseph Nguyen's contribution is not to have discovered something original. It is to have found a voice that made this ancient insight land for a generation that had become allergic to the traditional containers in which it is usually delivered, the religious containers, the academic containers, the clinical containers. And for the reader who encounters this insight here, for the first time, in this accessible and genuinely warm voice, the reader who has been white-knuckling their way through anxiety for years with every technique and tool and hack available and has not yet found anything that reaches the root, this book can genuinely be a door, not the destination.
A door.
A moment of seeing something that, once seen, cannot be entirely unseen. The thought is not the truth. The thinking is not the reality. The suffering is not inevitable. That recognition, however incomplete the book that carries it, is worth something real. Hold it lightly. Take it to the professionals if you need to. Don't stop therapy, because this book told you the root cause of all suffering is simple. Don't conclude you are uniquely broken when the non-thinking state proves harder to access than the confident tone implies. Don't use the framework as a reason to dismiss genuine pain, your own or anyone else's. But do notice the thought. Do notice when you are adding energy to a story that doesn't need more energy. Do notice the difference between the weather of thought passing through and the elaborate architecture of suffering you sometimes build around it. And in those moments of noticing, quiet, immediate, available without technique or practice or perfection, you might find what the book is actually pointing at, which has been there the whole time, waiting, like sunlight behind clouds, for the clouds to pass.